Amara had always been the kind of person who cared about the people around her, especially in her small neighborhood. She wasn't the most popular girl at school, nor did she have any special talents that made her stand out. But what she did have was a big heart, a sense of responsibility, and a deep love for her community. People knew her as the kind of person who would lend a hand to anyone in need, even if it meant going out of her way. On this particular evening, Amara had just finished her homework and was heading home from school. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the streets as she walked along, humming a tune. The neighborhood she lived in was quiet, and the small houses lined the streets, their front yards dotted with trees and flowers. Amara loved the peace and simplicity of it all. As she walked, she noticed something strange. A faint smell of smoke was in the air, something that shouldn't have been there. At first, she thought it might just be from someone cooking dinner, but the smell grew stronger. It wasn't long before she saw the faint outline of smoke rising from the house a few doors down. That house belonged to Mr. Harold, an elderly man who lived alone. He had been a neighbor for years, always friendly, but a little too quiet for most people to get to know him well. His wife had passed away several years ago, and his children lived far away, so he kept mostly to himself. Amara's heart skipped a beat. She had seen Mr. Harold sitting on his porch earlier in the day, enjoying the sunshine. Now she could see flames licking the edges of his roof. Without thinking twice, she began to run towards the house. As she got closer, the smoke grew thicker, and the heat from the fire seemed to reach her. She knew she couldn't just stand there. Amara's mind raced. What if Mr. Harold was still inside? What if he couldn't escape? There was no time to waste. She ran up the porch steps and tried to open the front door. It was locked. The smoke was growing heavier, and the air was thick with the smell of burning wood. Panic began to rise in her chest, but she pushed it away. She had to focus. In a split second, Amara remembered a trick she had seen someone use in a movie. With all her strength, she kicked the door hard, and it broke open with a loud crash. As she stumbled inside, the sight that greeted her was terrifying. The fire had already spread across the living room, and thick smoke filled the air, making it hard to breathe. But through the smoke, Amara spotted Mr. Harold, coughing and struggling to get to the door. He was too weak to move quickly on his own. "Mr. Harold, it's me, Amara," she shouted, trying to get his attention. He looked up, his face pale with fear, but his eyes seemed too dazed to fully understand what was happening. Amara didn't waste another second. She grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the door as fast as she could. The heat from the fire was unbearable, but Amara didn't stop. She helped Mr. Harold down the steps, guiding him away from the flames, and then they both collapsed onto the grass just as the firefighters arrived. Amara was shaking, but she couldn't help feeling proud of herself. She had done it. She had saved Mr. Harold. He wasn't the easiest person to get along with, and they hadn't always talked much. But today, she had done something she would never forget. And as she looked at Mr. Harold, who was breathing heavily but alive, Amara felt a deep sense of relief and accomplishment. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a story that would change both their lives forever. The fire trucks were loud as they pulled up to Mr. Harold's house, and the firefighters jumped out in a hurry. Their gear was heavy, but they moved with quick precision, ready to do their job. Amara, still panting from the rush, stood on the grass with Mr. Harold, who was gasping for air and looking at his house in shock. The flames were still roaring, licking the sides of the roof and pouring out of the windows. The firefighters immediately got to work, setting up hoses and working to bring the fire under control. Amara felt a rush of emotions: relief, fear, and even a little bit of pride. She had saved Mr. Harold's life, but now she was worried about what would happen to his house. The fire was already doing serious damage. The roof was beginning to collapse, and the windows had shattered from the heat. It was clear that the house would never be the same again. Mr. Harold, his face a mix of exhaustion and confusion, sat down on the grass, unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. Amara stayed by his side, trying to calm him, though she was just as shaken as he was. She knew it wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. There was still a lot to deal with. The fire department quickly took charge, making sure the flames were completely out. After what seemed like hours, the smoke began to clear, leaving only the charred remains of the house behind. Mr. Harold's once pristine home was now a shell of what it used to be, and Amara couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness for him. She had been the one to pull him out of the burning house, and now it felt like a part of him had been lost. As the firefighters wrapped up their work and began to pack up their equipment, Amara turned to Mr. Harold. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft and concerned. He nodded slowly, though he still looked dazed. I don't know what happened," he murmured, his voice weak. "I didn't even hear the fire until it was too late." Amara gently helped him to his feet, making sure he didn't stumble. "It's okay, Mr. Harold. You're safe now. That's all that matters." Mr. Harold looked at her with gratitude in his eyes. "You saved my life, Amara," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I can't thank you enough for what you did." Amara smiled at him, but inside, she felt conflicted. She had done something heroic, yes, but the situation was far from over. What would happen next? How would Mr. Harold rebuild his life after losing his home? And what about the damage to his personal belongings? She didn't have the answers, but one thing was for sure. Her actions had set something in motion that neither she nor Mr. Harold could have predicted. The sun had fully set by the time the last of the fire trucks pulled away. Amara stood there for a moment, watching the remains of Mr. Harold's house. The quiet of the evening seemed to settle over her, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind of silence that made her realize that sometimes, even when you do something good, the consequences can be unpredictable. And little did Amara know, the next day would bring even more surprises, ones that would challenge everything she thought she knew about doing the right thing. The next morning, Amara woke up feeling exhausted, but also relieved. It had been a long night, and the events of the previous day still weighed heavily on her mind. The image of Mr. Harold sitting on the grass, looking stunned and shaken, kept replaying in her head. She couldn't stop thinking about the fire, about how close they had come to losing everything. But at least Mr. Harold was safe. That was the only thing that really mattered. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mom, asking if she was all right. Amara quickly typed back that everything was fine and that she was going to meet with her friends later to talk about what happened. It was comforting to know that her mom was looking out for her, though Amara didn't want to worry her more than she had to. After finishing her breakfast, Amara decided to take a walk around the block. The weather was perfect, a soft breeze blowing through the trees, and the sun shining brightly as it began to warm the streets. As she walked, she couldn't help but notice that the neighborhood felt different. People were talking more, and there was a kind of buzz in the air. Everyone had heard about the fire, and everyone seemed to be talking about it. Amara didn't mind the attention at first. After all, she had done something good. She had saved Mr. Harold. But as she walked past a group of neighbors, she overheard one of them whisper, "Did you hear? He's going to sue her for the damage to his stuff." Amara froze in her tracks, her heart sinking. Sue her? That didn't make sense. She had saved his life. How could he want to sue her? Confused and worried, Amara headed back home. Her stomach churned as she wondered what was going on. She had to know if what she had heard was true. But before she could even process everything, there was a knock at the door. Amara opened it to find a man in a suit standing on her porch, holding a briefcase. His serious expression made her uneasy. "Hello," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm Mr. Sullivan. I'm here on behalf of Mr. Harold. We need to talk about the damage to his property." Amara blinked, her mind racing. "Damage? What do you mean?" Mr. Sullivan stepped forward, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Mr. Harold has filed a claim for damages caused during the fire. He believes that some of his personal belongings were destroyed when you rushed in to rescue him. He's seeking compensation. Amara's mind spun. This wasn't right. She had been the one to save him, to get him out of that burning house. How could he be asking for compensation? Wasn't his life more important than a few items? I don't understand, she stammered. I saved his life. I didn't mean to break anything. I just wanted to get him out. Mr. Sullivan nodded, but his expression didn't change. I understand, but Mr. Harold insists on pursuing the matter. He feels that the damage to his property should be addressed. Amara's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't believe what was happening. The person she had helped, the person she had risked her life for, was now turning against her. She had done everything right. She had saved him. And now she was being dragged into a legal issue that she never expected. Mr. Sullivan handed her some papers, explaining that she would need to respond to the claim within a certain amount of time. Amara didn't know what to say. She just stood there, staring at the papers in disbelief, her mind still trying to process everything. As the lawyer left, Amara stood frozen on her porch, feeling more lost and confused than ever. How had things gone from saving a life to this? Why was Mr. Harold doing this to her? She didn't know what to do or where to turn. All she knew was that her life had just taken a strange and unexpected turn. And the worst part was, she had no idea what would happen next. The next day was the strangest one Amara had ever experienced. She couldn't focus on anything. Her mind kept drifting back to the conversation she'd had with the lawyer. The moment he handed her those papers, it was like everything around her stopped making sense. She had saved Mr. Harold's life just the day before. And now, just a few hours later, she was facing a legal claim over the damage she had accidentally caused during the rescue. She tried to talk to her mom about it, but every time she brought it up, her mom would shake her head in disbelief. This doesn't make sense, Amara. You did the right thing. You saved his life. He can't possibly be mad at you for that, her mom had said, trying to calm her down. But Amara wasn't so sure. The more she thought about it, the more confused she became. To make matters worse, word about the fire and the legal claim was quickly spreading through the neighborhood. Amara had always been known as a helpful person, the kind of girl who would always lend a hand, but now she could sense people were talking about her behind her back. The looks she got from her neighbors were different, colder somehow. It wasn't long before she heard the whispers. Did you hear? She's being sued by Mr. Harold. Can you believe that? Amara felt like the walls were closing in. She didn't know how to explain it, how to make people understand that she hadn't done anything wrong. All she had done was try to help an elderly man who was in danger. Yet here she was, accused of damaging his property. It felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Later that afternoon, as Amara sat at the kitchen table, still holding the papers from the lawyer, her phone buzzed. It was a text from her best friend, Jasmine. Hey, I heard about what happened. Want to talk about it? Amara quickly typed back, telling Jasmine to come over. She needed someone to talk to. Her friend showed up about half an hour later, her expression serious. Amara explained everything that had happened, from rushing into the burning house to the lawyer's visit. I don't get it, Amara said, her voice filled with frustration. How can he be suing me? I was just trying to help him. Jasmine sighed, shaking her head. This doesn't make sense, Amara. You did what anyone would do in that situation. You saved him. Maybe he's just confused or not thinking clearly. Amara thought about that. Could it be true? Was Mr. Harold so shaken by the fire that he wasn't thinking straight? Or maybe someone was influencing him. He had no family close by, but what if his relatives, the ones who lived far away, were putting ideas in his head? As she sat there, trying to make sense of everything, the doorbell rang again. This time, it was a different person. Amara opened the door to find a woman standing there, holding a clipboard. Hello, I'm Mrs. Langford. I'm one of Mr. Harold's distant relatives, the woman said, offering a forced smile. I just wanted to check on how you're doing after the fire. I know it must have been a difficult experience for you. Amara was taken aback by the woman's sudden appearance. She hadn't expected anyone from Mr. Harold's family to show up. "I'm fine, thank you," Amara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "But I'm a little confused about what's going on with Mr. Harold." Mrs. Langford glanced around, then lowered her voice. "Well, you see, Mr. Harold is in a difficult position. He's been through a lot lately, and we're just trying to make sure everything is handled properly. You know how important his belongings are to him." Amara felt her stomach tighten. There was something about the way Mrs. Langford spoke that didn't sit right with her. "I don't understand," Amara said slowly. "I didn't mean to damage anything. I just wanted to get Mr. Harold out of the fire. I didn't even think about the stuff inside." Mrs. Langford smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, dear, we know you meant well. But sometimes it's just about protecting what's left. I'm sure everything will work out fine. Just make sure you cooperate with the legal process, okay?" The words felt like a warning, and Amara couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest. Was Mr. Harold being pressured into this legal claim? Was it really his idea to sue her, or was someone else pulling the strings? As the door closed behind Mrs. Langford, Amara felt more confused than ever. But one thing was clear: this situation wasn't just about a simple mistake. There was something more going on, and Amara was determined to find out what it was. The next few days felt like a blur for Amara. Her world had turned upside down in the span of just 24 hours. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Mr. Harold had been so grateful when she saved him, but now, all of a sudden, he was pursuing a legal claim against her. And it didn't help that his distant relative, Mrs. Langford, seemed to be acting strangely, as if she were trying to smooth things over in a way that didn't quite feel honest. Amara couldn't stop thinking about it. Why would Mr. Harold, a man she had risked her life to save, want to sue her? How could he go from being thankful to accusing her of damaging his belongings? The more she thought about it, the more questions she had, and the more she realized that there was something deeper going on. She spent the next few days trying to figure out what was really happening. She knew that if she didn't do something, the legal claim might just get worse. So she decided to take matters into her own hands. She knew she needed help, so she reached out to her family and friends. Her best friend, Jasmine, was there for her every step of the way. Together, they began to investigate what was really going on with Mr. Harold. Jasmine, being a lot more outgoing and outspoken than Amara, took the lead. She called around, trying to find out more about Mr. Harold's relatives. She learned that Mrs. Langford wasn't just any distant relative. She was actually a niece of Mr. Harold, and she had been the one in charge of his finances ever since his wife had passed away. This was a key piece of the puzzle. Amara couldn't believe it when she heard about Mrs. Langford. She had only met the woman once, but something about her had made Amara feel uneasy. It seemed too coincidental that Mrs. Langford had shown up so quickly after the fire, acting like everything was just fine, even though Amara was clearly struggling with the situation. The more Amara and Jasmine dug into the family's background, the more suspicious they became. It turned out that Mr. Harold's relatives had been trying to get control over his estate for years. His health had been slowly declining, and they were eager to inherit his property, including his valuable antiques and artwork. It was becoming clear that they were more interested in Mr. Harold's belongings than in his well-being. Amara felt a knot tighten in her stomach as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. It wasn't Mr. Harold who wanted to sue her, it was his relatives. They had found a way to use him to get what they wanted. His dementia, which had been getting worse, made him an easy target. He was confused, and they were using that to their advantage, pushing him to take legal action against her. With this new information, Amara felt a sense of determination. She wasn't going to let Mr. Harold's family take advantage of him, especially not after she had saved his life. She knew that the only way to fix this was to go directly to Mr. Harold and make him understand what was really happening. But she also knew it wouldn't be easy. Mr. Harold was in no condition to fully grasp everything, and she had no idea how much his relatives had influenced him. Amara decided to take a step forward. She called Mr. Harold's nursing home and arranged to visit him. It wasn't going to be easy, but she was determined to clear things up. She wanted him to know that she hadn't meant any harm. When Amara arrived at the nursing home, she was nervous but ready. The nurses greeted her with smiles, and she was led to Mr. Harold's room. He was sitting in a chair by the window, staring out at the garden. His once vibrant eyes seemed dull, and his face looked tired. "Mr. Harold," Amara said softly, walking into the room. He looked up at her, his face lighting up with recognition. "Amara," he said weakly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You're the girl who saved me." Amara sat down beside him, trying to smile back, though her heart ached. "Yes, Mr. Harold. I just wanted to make sure you were okay." He nodded slowly, his brow furrowed as if trying to remember something. "Yes, I remember. The fire. You saved me." "I'm so glad you're okay," Amara said, her voice shaking slightly. "But there's something I need to talk to you about. It's about the legal claim." Mr. Harold blinked, looking confused. "Legal claim?" Amara sighed, carefully choosing her words. "Mr. Harold, I don't think you understand what's going on. Your family, they've been pressuring you. They want to take action against me because of the damage to your things during the fire." His face grew pale. "My family. I didn't know that." Amara reached out and gently took his hand. "I know, Mr. Harold. I know you didn't mean for this to happen, but your family is using you to get what they want. They want the money from your insurance, and they don't care about the damage to your house. They just care about your things." Amara spent the next few days feeling a mixture of hope and anxiety. She had done what she could to speak to Mr. Harold, but she wasn't sure how much he really understood. She knew he had been confused, and his memory wasn't as sharp as it used to be. Still, something about their conversation had made her feel like there was a small chance he might remember what she had said. But she also knew it wasn't enough to fix everything just yet. Jasmine continued to help Amara with her plan. They reached out to a lawyer who specialized in elder care and abuse, hoping to get some professional advice. The lawyer, a kind woman named Mrs. Dawson, listened carefully as Amara explained everything that had happened, about the fire, the legal claim, and the strange behavior of Mr. Harold's relatives. "That's very concerning," Mrs. Dawson had said, her tone serious. "It sounds like Mr. Harold is being taken advantage of. His relatives may be using his condition to get what they want. We'll need to act quickly before they can do any more damage." Amara felt a wave of relief wash over her. At least now she had someone who understood the situation and was ready to help. Mrs. Dawson assured her that they would work together to protect Mr. Harold's rights. The lawyer suggested they try to speak with Mr. Harold's doctor to see if they could get an official statement about his mental state, which could help with the legal situation. Amara knew that this wouldn't be easy. Mr. Harold's relatives, especially Mrs. Langford, were already making it clear they wouldn't give up easily. But Amara wasn't about to let them take advantage of the man she had saved. She had to act fast, and she had to be smart. The next week, Amara and Mrs. Dawson arranged a meeting with Mr. Harold's doctor. It wasn't a pleasant visit, but it was necessary. The doctor confirmed that Mr. Harold's memory had been steadily declining due to early-stage dementia. He couldn't always remember recent events clearly, and that made him vulnerable to manipulation. The doctor agreed to write a statement explaining Mr. Harold's condition, which would help strengthen their case. Armed with this information, Amara felt more confident. She wasn't going to let his relatives control the situation anymore. She knew that it was time to confront Mrs. Langford and her family. They needed to understand that their actions were wrong and that they couldn't keep using Mr. Harold's condition for their own gain. The confrontation came sooner than she expected. Mrs. Langford called Amara one afternoon, asking to meet. Amara wasn't sure what to expect, but she agreed. She met Mrs. Langford in a small cafe, where the woman looked more polished and professional than Amara had remembered. "So, Amara, Mrs. Langford began, "I hope you've been thinking about how to resolve this matter. Mr. Harold's situation is complicated, and we believe that you should be held responsible for the damage to his property." Amara didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I know what you're trying to do," she said firmly. "I spoke to Mr. Harold's doctor. I know about his condition. He's not in a state to make decisions like this. You and your family are taking advantage of him, and it needs to stop." Mrs. Langford's face tightened, but she didn't respond right away. Amara could tell she was trying to maintain control of the situation, but the words weren't coming as easily as they had before. "You don't understand," Mrs. Langford said slowly. "Mr. Harold's estate is valuable. We're only looking out for his best interests." "No," Amara shot back. "You're looking out for your own interests. You don't care about Mr. Harold. If you did, you wouldn't be using his confusion to try and take advantage of him." The conversation grew tense, and Amara could see the cracks beginning to show in Mrs. Langford's carefully constructed demeanor. She had thought she could intimidate Amara into backing down, but Amara wasn't going to let her. "You don't know how hard it's been," Mrs. Langford muttered, almost under her breath. "We've been taking care of him for years. It's not easy. We have to make sure everything is handled properly." Amara wasn't about to let her guilt trip her. "You've been taking care of him. Really? Then why don't you take care of him the right way? Why don't you help him, instead of trying to control him for your own gain?" For a moment, there was silence. Then Mrs. Langford sighed heavily and leaned back in her chair. "Maybe I've gone about this the wrong way," she said, her voice softer now, though there was still a trace of bitterness. "But I'm not giving up easily. If you think you can stop this, you're wrong." Amara wasn't sure what Mrs. Langford meant by that, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to back down. She had to protect Mr. Harold, and she was ready to fight for him, no matter what. As she left the cafe, her heart was heavy, but she felt renewed. Amara's determination grew stronger each day as she worked tirelessly to protect Mr. Harold. The legal battle had only just begun, but she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. With the help of Mrs. Dawson, the lawyer, Amara started gathering all the evidence they needed. Mrs. Dawson was confident that they had a solid case, especially with the doctor's statement confirming Mr. Harold's mental condition. But Amara knew that the road ahead would be filled with obstacles. The relatives would not give up easily. Despite everything, there were moments of doubt. Amara still couldn't fully understand why Mr. Harold's family had resorted to these actions. It didn't make sense. They had to know that taking advantage of him was wrong. But as she thought about it, she realized they might not care. For them, the property and money were far more important than Mr. Harold's well-being. It was sad, but it seemed to be the reality she had to face. Jasmine continued to be her rock during this time, offering emotional support and even helping her gather more information about Mr. Harold's relatives. Jasmine was relentless in her pursuit of the truth, and together they learned more about Mrs. Langford and the rest of the family. It seemed that they had been eyeing Mr. Harold's estate for years, waiting for the right moment to make a move. This was no longer just about the fire. It was about a much larger scheme to control everything Mr. Harold had worked his whole life for. One afternoon, as Amara was sitting at her kitchen table, looking over some papers, her phone rang. It was Mrs. Dawson. "Amara, I think we have a breakthrough," Mrs. Dawson said, her voice sounding hopeful but also cautious. "I've been looking over Mr. Harold's will, and there's something important in there that could help us." Amara's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What did you find?" "I can't say too much just yet, but there's a clause in the will that could give us leverage. If we can prove Mr. Harold wasn't in a sound state of mind when the will was updated, it could invalidate some of his family's claims. This might be our chance to protect him." Amara felt a spark of hope, but she also knew it wouldn't be easy to prove. The legal battle was far from over. She needed to be careful and make sure she didn't jump to conclusions, but the fact that there was a potential opening made her feel a little lighter. Over the next few days, Amara and Mrs. Dawson worked together to prepare for the next step. They gathered statements from Mr. Harold's doctors, family friends, and anyone who could attest to his condition at the time the will had been updated. It was clear that Mr. Harold's relatives had tried to take advantage of his decline, and they were now using his confusion to push forward with their own agenda. The more they uncovered, the more Amara realized just how far they were willing to go to get what they wanted. But Amara wasn't intimidated. She was determined to keep fighting, not just for Mr. Harold, but for the justice he deserved. One day, while she was at the nursing home visiting Mr. Harold, she noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. Mrs. Langford was there, talking to the nurse at the front desk. It was unusual to see her at the nursing home during this time of day, and Amara couldn't help but wonder what she was doing there. Amara tried to remain calm, but the thought of Mrs. Langford possibly trying to manipulate things behind her back made her anxious. She quickly made her way to Mr. Harold's room, where he was sitting in his favorite armchair, staring out the window as usual. She took a deep breath before sitting down beside him. "Mr. Harold, I just wanted to check in on you," she said softly. He looked at her with a warm smile. "Ah, Amara, my hero. I'm so glad you're here." Amara smiled, though her thoughts were elsewhere. She had to know if Mr. Harold was being pressured in any way. "Mr. Harold, I need to ask you something important. Have you had any visitors recently? Maybe someone from your family?" His face grew a little puzzled as he tried to think. "Family? Oh yes. My niece, Mrs. Langford, yes. She came by earlier, just to check on me." Very kind of her. Amara felt a knot in her stomach. She didn't like the sound of that. It was clear that Mrs. Langford was still trying to control the situation. But Amara had to be careful. She couldn't let her emotions get the best of her. She needed to stick to the plan and keep gathering the right evidence. "I'm glad she's checking on you, Mr. Harold," Amara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "But I just want you to know that I'm here for you too, okay? I'm going to make sure everything works out, I promise." Mr. Harold nodded, but there was a faraway look in his eyes. Amara knew she couldn't give up. She couldn't let Mrs. Langford or anyone else take advantage of him. The days that followed were filled with anticipation and tension. Amara knew that the end of the legal battle was drawing near, and she could feel the weight of everything on her shoulders. But she also knew that she had done everything she could. Her heart and mind were focused on ensuring that Mr. Harold's rights were protected, no matter what. With Mrs. Dawson's guidance, Amara had continued to gather evidence and meet with witnesses who could testify to Mr. Harold's condition and the manipulative actions of his relatives. Slowly but surely, their case was becoming stronger. The doctor's statement about Mr. Harold's mental state had been a crucial piece of evidence, and it was starting to make an impact. They had also uncovered details about how his relatives had been trying to take advantage of him for months, if not longer. It wasn't easy, but Amara found strength in the knowledge that she was doing the right thing. Jasmine, too, continued to stand by her side, offering words of encouragement when Amara felt discouraged. They had become a team, one that wasn't just fighting for Mr. Harold's belongings, but for his dignity and well-being. One afternoon, Amara received a call from Mrs. Dawson. It was time for the final hearing. "We have everything in place," Mrs. Dawson said. "We've got the doctor's statement, witness testimony, and all the other documentation. I'm confident we can put an end to this, Amara." Her heart raced as she heard the lawyer's words. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Amara knew that they still faced challenges, especially with Mrs. Langford and her relatives being as relentless as ever, but she couldn't back down now. It had been a long journey, and she had come too far to stop fighting. The day of the hearing arrived, and Amara walked into the courtroom with a sense of purpose. She was nervous, but she also felt more determined than ever. The court was packed, with Mr. Harold's relatives sitting at one table, their expressions cold and focused. Mrs. Langford gave Amara a sharp look when she entered, but Amara didn't let it faze her. She was there for a reason. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Mrs. Dawson spoke first, laying out their case clearly and methodically. She explained Mr. Harold's condition, the manipulation by his relatives, and the evidence they had gathered. Amara sat quietly, listening intently, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone in the room was trying to turn the situation in their favor. Then it was Amara's turn to speak. Her hands trembled slightly as she stood and made her way to the witness stand. But as she looked at Mr. Harold's relatives, she felt a surge of courage. This wasn't about them. It was about protecting Mr. Harold. "I'm here because I care about Mr. Harold," Amara began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I'm not doing this for any other reason than to make sure that he is treated with the respect and care he deserves. When I saved him from the fire, it wasn't just to help him survive. It was because he's a person. And he matters. I don't want him to be used by anyone, especially not his own family." Her words echoed in the quiet room, and for the first time, she saw Mrs. Langford flinch. It was a small reaction, but it told Amara everything she needed to know. Deep down, Mrs. Langford knew that what she was doing was wrong. Amara continued, "Mr. Harold deserves to make decisions for himself, and right now, he's not in a position to do so. His relatives have been taking advantage of his condition, and I won't stand by and let that happen. He deserves better." The judge listened carefully and then turned to the opposing side. Mrs. Langford tried to speak, but the judge interrupted her, saying, "We've heard enough. I've reviewed the evidence and statements. It's clear that Mr. Harold's mental state has been compromised and that his family has been using his condition to further their own interests." Amara's heart pounded as she waited for the judge's decision. It felt like an eternity before the judge spoke again, but when he did, his words were clear. "I'm ruling in favor of the plaintiff, Amara," the judge said. "This case will be dismissed, and Mr. Harold's will be re-examined. I will ensure that his best interests are protected moving forward." Amara felt a wave of relief wash over her. The battle was finally over, and they had won. Mr. Harold would be safe. She looked over at the elderly man who had been sitting quietly in the courtroom, surrounded by his doctors and friends. His face lit up when he saw her, and she couldn't help but smile. "Thank you, Amara," he whispered softly, his voice full of gratitude. "You saved me, not just from the fire, but from something far worse." Tears welled up in Amara's eyes as she nodded. "I'm just glad I could help, Mr. Harold. You don't deserve to be treated this way."